We're back!
Hello.
Skeleton Songs, Series 2.
Season 2.
Season 2. And this
The
time...
Season of Darkness.
Yeah, it's still goth, but it's not about gothic literature.
No, it's about...
The other word beginning with G that we get paid for.
Gammon, yes. No, so we want to talk about things adjacent to games rather than actually games. You know about games already. And
Well, and also we want to talk about some of the big topics that you hear mentioned several times, or lots of times, when you listen to gaming podcasts or you read journals or whatever. But we want to talk about them in a different way. So I think, if I'm correct, this episode is going to be about genre, which initially you hear and you think, well, that's pretty boring, whatever. But we're going to talk about it through the lens of D&D, Aristotle's Poetics, he promised me.
That's the fella.
And all sorts of nonsense that you won't hear elsewhere.
That's us. Nonsense you won't hear elsewhere.
Put it on your bumper stickers.
So D&D. I want to travel back in time to 1979, 1980. I can't vouch for the year. And you have to imagine 8-year-old AK...
So small.
Sitting in a swimming pool viewing gallery because I had an earache or something, so I couldn't get into the water. I was skiving in a run-down swimming pool in East Oxford, and tiny, nerdy, terribly shy AK overhears the two boys in the seats in front of him, and they're talking about hit points, and they've got a book with a blue. They've got a blue book with a dragon on the cover, with the whole thing sort of blue tinted. And if you are an aficionado of ancient RPGs, you may recognise this as before even the distinction between basic and expert D&D and advanced D&D. This was the very first D&D rulebook which reached these shores through, I believe, the good offices of Ian Livingstone originally. And I was just entranced that it changed the whole direction of my life. I hadn't been sitting in this crappy swimming pool in 1980. I probably wouldn't have ended up making games. I certainly wouldn't have played TRPGs for decades. And that's where we come into genre, isn't it? Because D&D established a genre that didn't exist before, but it all could have worked out quite differently. Can I talk about fish genitals?
Oh, if you must.
So
we're 2.5 minutes in. We've got to get there sometime.
Nonsense you can't get elsewhere.
Go for it.
I wrote my very first column actually for Eurogamer, because I did a couple of years worth of nonsense for them, about the genesis of D&D and how it happened to happen. And I drew on on an analogy from a reproductive biologist, Jack Cohen, who I think is dead now, but used to talk very engagingly about xenobiology. And he reckoned, and I can't vouch for the accuracy of this, that it so happened that we, the whole sort of mammalian line, the whole vertebrate line, emerged from a species of fish which happened to have their genitals near their cloaca and their waste ducts.
He said it, ladies and gents. He said cloaca.
And rather than, on their foreheads or under their armpits. And because of this, we have genitalia that are near the poo and the wee. And so, to use the technical terms.
Welcome back to Skeleton Songs!
And so we've developed a particular set of attitudes to sex, it being forbidden and dirty. And Cohen proposed, didn't argue, but proposed that if we'd happened to evolve from fish that work differently, maybe we'd go around with our genitals somewhere less rubby, and we'd end up having a completely different attitude to sex. And D&D's sort of like that, because
its
so happened.
It's also close to its extremities.
Well, it's all about the dungeons, the parts beneath, right?
Oh God, I regret this.
What was that phrase that Tolkien used about Shelob? All about the dangly parts down below, the sort of ripe, fruity... I can't remember.
I think you're projecting. Anyway. The key thing was that she was bubbling. There was lots of bubbling,
God, there was
which
the
I
bubbling.
really didn't like.
But it so happened that a particular set of wargaming nerds in 77, I think, 78 in Wisconsin, happened to bolt some rules for small-scale tactics and character progression onto a set of wargame rules. Everything took off from there. When did you first hear of D&D?
What I was going to say, I mean, not really until, well, I'm firstly not as much of a nerd as you, or certainly didn't have as nerdy an upbringing as you.
That's fair.
And I wasn't around for the first flush of D&D. I didn't know anyone who played it. I'm younger than you, so I wasn't actually there when D&D first started. And once I met you and we started talking about this stuff, I was pretty shocked actually that so much of the kind of elements that I would assume are part and parcel of certain genres of video games, like classes and skills and skill trees and races and all this kind of stuff that we just assume makes up a genre, so much of that appears to be taken from D&D, or at least TRPGs, and D&D is obviously one of the biggest and most popular and enduring. And I think there's my whole generation, unless you know somebody who plays D&D, you'd never connect the two. And this is what you're saying fundamentally, that because things happened a certain way back in 1979 and 1980, they now make video games the way they do in 2021. But there's very little that would connect the origin to the genres we see today. And I think that I mean, it's not a problem because, you know, the video games industry is one of the few industries currently doing pretty well out of this whole pandemic business. But it is, I think, better if people questioned it a bit more and maybe thought, why is it the way it is and why do we have this system set up? Because then we tend to get more innovation and interesting things.
I was saying the other day that my hero is a small boy called Kevin from Time Bandits, who in a conversation with the Supreme Being, somebody says, don't be silly, you might as well ask why we have to have free will. And he says, yes, why do we have to have free will? Or why do we have to have good and evil? And it's very easy to assume things are the way they are because they are the way they are. And actually, if you look at why they are the way they are, you find something interesting. So like you said, at class level, original D&D didn't have anything nearly as sophisticated as a skill system. But magic users not wearing armour, orcs as a standard disposable baddie.
But they also introduced things like, didn't they have like hit points and magic points, which is just, you have a sort of scale which you now assume goes up and down with your skill level or the actions you take, which ultimately comes from this sense of you have 1 to 10 magic points.
So they did have hit points, they didn't have magic points, and that's, I think, exactly the kind of random evolutionary consequence that we're talking about. In original flavour D&D and D&D still to this day with a lot of character classes, you decide which spells you have access to at the beginning of the day, and you memorise those spells, and you can use them up. So if you decide as a wizard that you want to your second level spell or third or whatever it is to be web rather than levitation, then you end up with 3 web spells, and if you find yourself in no situations where you need a web, then you're out of luck. And the reason this is the case is because of Jack Vance, who, as you know, I adore. Jack Vance's very first set of novels, the Dying Earth stuff, he happened upon this idea that magicians could squeeze a few spells into their brain at a time, and spells are so powerful you can't fit many in, and they'll discharge themselves once used. Gary Gygax read this in the 70s and he thought, that sounds like an easy way to control the number of spells that you can use a day. Now, magic points are generally a much better system because they're simpler, because they don't require you to write down the list of spells you memorise, because there's more versatility, but and most other games went that way or something adjacent. But you can still play plenty of CRPGs that have memorised spells on a D&D basis because Gary Gygax happened to be more of a fan of Jack Vance than he was of Tolkien.
Which was a mistake in my book, but
I don't know.
It happened the way it happened. Really? You'd choose Vance over Tolkien?
Oh, don't make me murder my fucking Sophie's Choice firstborn babies.
But this is interesting because my take on genre is a slightly broader look at it. I approach it fundamentally from a kind of marketing-y, consumer-y thing. And my spiel is essentially it is both useful and useless.
You sound like a literature student.
I do not sound like an idiot, but I will explain it thus. That genre is this kind of byword that we use to immediately communicate to somebody who doesn't know anything about a game what kind of game it is. So if I'm the sort of person who likes Skyrim, I'm also the sort of person who's going to probably like Fallout. Now, I could say to the person who's played Skyrim, oh, well, if you like this, there's a game that's full of guns set in an apocalyptic wasteland where you collect stuff, and then also there are quests. And they might go, okay, yeah, that sounds my kind of thing. Or I could say, you like an open world RPG? Bam, you should play this game. And that is a system that a lot of people understand. It's a system on which a lot of our stores are based. So Steam puts a hell of a lot of emphasis on Steam tags and descriptions, and you can literally click through genre pages to find, the top RPGs, the top simulators, the top visual novels, whatever it is. But that also is an albatross around our neck, because you and I particularly set out to try and make innovative games that people haven't seen before. So when we were making Cultist Simulator, as a marketing director of a team of two, I found it quite hard to work out how to describe it, because what is Cultist Simulator? Well, it's a Lovecraftian horror game that's also a narrative game that's played through the interface of cards on a tabletop, but it's kind of a choose your own adventure, and it's an RPG, but it's also a simulator because it says simulator in the title, and you're simulating being a cult
This
leader.
is notoriously a problem with Fallen London too. It's very
Was
odd.
it?
Yeah.
Which, for people who don't know, was AK's first game, really, wasn't it? First video game. And so that's wonderful, because if you can get somebody and you can say, actually, it doesn't fit into any category, most people are interested, because they're like, oh yeah, bring it on, what's this new category that you got? And that's a great hook. But on the other hand, I can't immediately communicate to somebody like that exactly what this game is. And seeing as, people aren't interested in everything they see, and they're busy, and you've got to grab people's attention when you can, that's a problem. On the flip side, from a consumer's and a gamer's point of view, genres are so big that often they're meaningless. So I notice, again, thinking about the PC game landscape, that Steam have started incrementally digging into the genres. So it's no longer just an RPG. It's now, okay, what do you want? Do you want a JRPG? Do you want a simulator RPG? Do you want a tabletop RPG? Do you want an RPG, that has this or that? Because nowadays there are so many games and there's so much variety that saying something is just one of the big genres like simulator or I don't know, fighting game or whatever it is, doesn't actually communicate that much, because within that gigantic pool of titles, there's going to be lots of stuff that actually aren't for you. So we rely on it, but it's also not good enough, but it's also incredibly helpful, but it's also rubbish.
I think so from a marketing point of view, from a consumer point of view, I think you're bang on. I think genres work in other ways as well. I think when you are making games or making art generally, they provide you with some stable points to base assumptions on. So here's a really basic example. In the 90s, real-time strategy games were at their peak, and I know you're not an RTS lady really, but the standard convention in RTSs is that you click on a unit, you left click on a unit to select it, and then you right click to move attack. And that wasn't the case in every RTS. Some RTSs you left click to select and then left clicked to move, which is arguably a worse system innately, but there's nothing sort of fundamental about it. It's really confusing switching from one RTS to another in the late 90s, trying to remember which is which. And in the end, it's settled in one convention. So if I were making an RTS tomorrow, anything where you select unit and move it, I do left click, select, right click, move. And there's nothing fundamental that says that has to be the case, or that mice has to have 2 buttons rather than 5, or that use a mouse to do it. But by doing that, you start off with a point that that makes sense to people. And even Cultist Simulator, which doesn't fit a genre, you left click to pick something up and select it. It's a basic point of access. And one of the
actually, you use it in an interesting way as well, because you've got a lifelong obsession with cards. And you always say that the reason you like cards is because they come with a set of expectations which you can then play with. So when you give somebody a card, people expect certain things from it. Like you expect there to be multiple cards because you're used to them being in a deck. You expect them to have an image and some information on, but not so much information. You wouldn't click on a card and expect to have a whole kind of novel-length entry to read. You expect to be able to play them in combination with each other, all this kind of stuff. So you're actually using a totally different set of existing rules, which is essentially what a genre is, within a genre itself. And
the other thing about a genre from a creative point of view is that you can use the existing assumptions as a basis for subversion. And cards, for example, are things you hold on to and value and keep. And in Cultist Simulator, there are occasions where we deliberately set a card on fire. We'll do it quite early to say to you, don't get too attached to this. And legacy games, famously, there's a whole movement of games where you end up marking or tearing up cards.
That does feel wrong, doesn't it?
Exactly.
Didn't like that.
And it wouldn't feel as wrong and therefore as interesting if it weren't for the well-established conventions. But Steam, I'm gonna fancy up the joint by proposing two approaches to genre, and there's the Aristotelian and the Wittgensteinian.
Oh yes, the classic Aristotelian Wittgensteinian issue.
So Steam, obviously, falls on the Wittgensteinian side nowadays.
Because it's German and dead.
Because so Aristotle, I learnt the other day, because my knowledge is much shallower than it appears, so Aristotle's Poetics established a lot of the things that we think about fundamentals in terms of poetry and drama. And Aristotle, again, as you will know because you're more of a literature buff, laid down a lot of the things we just take for granted about the way that drama and poetry work these days. And he said, this is tragedy and this is comedy, and these are the kind of forms you should use when you're talking about it. And the point is, he says should. And he draws bright lines, and he says, this is on this side of the fence tragedy, on the other side of the fence is comedy. Wittgenstein, on the other hand, I think he said many different things in many different directions, many different times. But one of the points he made was the idea of family resemblances, that often you're trying to categorise things. It's very hard to categorise things in a way that is consistent all down the line. If you say chairs have four legs, then is a stool a chair? Is a chair that's had its leg sawn off a chair? Is a chair that's had all its legs sawn off a chair? Panthers,
Panthers, is that a chair?
Leopards are black and yellow unless they're melanistic leopards. Panthers, in which case they're black. So what distinguishes a leopard? And he was actually talking, interestingly for our purposes, about games. He said that if you try to define a game, this is long before video games, of course. You can talk about card games, you can talk about solitaire games, you can talk about playground games, and you will find as many differences as you find similarities. And you can trace a path where you say, well, you're following rules in a game, but then do children play games? Do we use the same word to describe them? Yes, because they've got other things in common with other games that are more rule-based, even if not all children's playground games are as structured. So one way to deal with genre is to have like an old-style video store. You've got romantic comedy here, you've got horror here, you've got weird European stuff over here.
The three genres.
The three genres. and David Lynch. And the other is the Wittgensteinian approach, the Steam approach of, here's a thread, why don't you follow the thread and see where it takes you? And if you go down to the bottom of Steam, at the bottom of Steam you find all kinds of rubbish. You go down to the bottom of the Steam store page and look at the games like this. You can follow through. And they've got a bunch of experiments around following this thread or finding what things are similar and what things are not. And the other side, the Aristotelian side of the genre, is your old friend and mine, the Berlin interpretation.
I was going to mention this. So I have a long-standing, entirely personal vendetta with roguelikes and roguelites. I have been scarred by, early on, naively, in the development of Cultist Simulator, I brightly decided, well, AK makes roguelike games, so I will pop into the subreddit are roguelikes and just talk about Cultist Simulator and see what people think. And people did not think good things about Cultist Simulator in the Are Roguelikes subreddit. It turns out, as you probably know, that a bunch of nerds in the 80s sat around and basically wrote a list of things that apparently mean a game is a roguelike, which, again, if you haven't ever thought about roguelikes, are games that are like an original game called Rogue. So innovation and imagination off the charts here, people. We now have a list of things that makes a game like a game called Rogue, which I would like to tell you is older than I am.
I would like to point out that it was not in fact the 1980s, but the Roguelike Development Conference in 2008.
You see, this is exactly what happens to people, ladies and gentlemen, when they start talking about the Berlin Convention. They turn into android dweebos.
The Berlin interpretation.
Whatever!
The point is that there's the other thing about genres, right, is their bases of identity. And if you say to a film buff, "Oh yeah, I saw the new Adam Sandler the other day. Do you watch much Adam Sandler?" You'll probably see lines develop on their forehead because when they think about film, they're probably thinking more about Bergman than last year's Hollywood stuff. But that sort of distinction is invisible unless you give a shit. And it's easy for us to be a bit snooty about roguelike purists who take it very seriously and don't like their lawn being invaded. But also, when I say I work in video games, somebody says, "Oh yeah, I play that FIFA. Do you do that kind of thing?"
Yeah.
And oh my god! But from the outside, what's the difference?
No, exactly. And I feel like legally I should say that I have nothing against roguelikes, and people who love roguelikes, in fact, please buy my game. It's great, and I love you. But I think it's an interesting way of dealing with genre, right? Because if you're saying we've got the Aristotelian and the Wittgensteinian approach, the roguelike approach I think is probably the most formalist that I've seen. It says if it does not meet some of these criteria, this is not a roguelike. It doesn't just say, I don't know, it's an RPG because you're role-playing a character at some point. And that has led to the creation of the roguelite, which is like it meets like one of the criteria, but a lot of the proper kind of fundamentalists would not accept it as a roguelike. And so that's an interesting deviation already from people who kind of like these kind of games. And if you put a human in front of these games, they could very quickly tell you this is a roguelike or this is not generally considered a roguelike. But if you ask a machine to go down a list of criteria, it's often a bit more complicated than that. And this, you mentioned sort of the Aristotelian literature side of things, and there is a school of thought that I won't go into because it's complicated and not about games, called the Russian formalists, who believed that there were, I think, 7 stories in the world. That was it, and every story ever told was an extrapolation of one of these original 7 stories. So they were very interested in going through all fiction and trying to codify it and say this is this story and this is that story, and it's an interesting approach. I don't personally think it's particularly helpful for what I'm interested in when I read books, but again, it's a sort of sense of putting things in their proper genre. Because if you think about books, what you have now is fiction and non-fiction. Well, that's extremely broad, but helpful, because I want to know if this is essentially true. And then once you're in fiction, you've got, just like games, all the subgenres, all of which will have little details about that particular title that might make it fit perfectly in one genre, but maybe only half fit in another genre, and people would argue about what genre it goes in. So yeah, it's the same thing.
I think, God damn it, no, it's gone straight out of my head. Can you cut this out so I sound smarter afterwards?
Yeah. Definitely going to do that, listeners. Definitely going to happen.
So one of the things about genre is that if we have to divide the world into categories all the time, or we
a little monkey brains can't cope.
But yeah, and it's edible and non-edible, and European
that is
and non-European.
The only distinction that matters.
Subatomic versus macroscopic, all this sort of stuff. But of course, as soon as you start looking at distinctions, you find things that cross the lines, things that don't fit. And there's this thing called the Sorites paradox, the Sorites fallacy, which points out that everyone knows what a heap of sand is, and everyone knows what a grain of sand is. But if you take one grain of sand away from a heap at a time, when does it stop being a heap? There's something you look at and say that's not a heap. It's like some sand. But when do you cross that line? But it doesn't mean that the term heap is useless any more than the term macroscopic or edible is useless. Even though I wouldn't eat geoduck or other foods not familiar to my native cuisine. So this comes back to you saying it's useful and useless.
Well, it's within the context, right? So I think your edible versus inedible is probably the most significant distinction that we as animals make, because we need to eat to survive, and it's important to know what we can eat and what we cannot eat. But in the context of where would you like to go for Valentine's Day, darling, it is totally useless to say, well, I'd like to go somewhere that serves edible food, because that is correct, so would I, but it doesn't help in the context of actually making a decision about something, which is exactly what the genre labels are for. They're not there just to sort of exist and just sort of float above you like a halo.
I really want a Mexican.
Dinner.
Yes. I do know.
but out of context, it's useless.
Fucking Cyberpunk.
Wow. Okay, so you brought that up with like 5 minutes left.
I have. I just
poor Cyberpunk.
No. So when I say fucking Cyberpunk, what I mean is if you play games, you're probably aware that CD Projekt Red brought out Cyberpunk 2077.
No one's heard of it.
The marketing campaign's pretty okay.
It's an RPG, and it's open world.
It's really good. It was pretty buggy on its launch. I played it on PC. It was much better, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I would recommend the hell out of it. There are a lot of things said about it, some are true, some are not. But I think the thing I found most eye-rolling was the degree to which people have tried to gatekeep cyberpunk, which was a loose phrase for a certain style of literature, not even really a genre, back in really the 80s. And it's been made to bear the weight of a lot of hobby horses interpretations since. Notoriously, even at the time, people were very snotty about cyberpunk being called a movement. But just like film noir, people happen on a noir or a cyberpunk text that they have affection for, and then it's oddly tempting to gatekeep things that they don't fit what they happen to think of as cyberpunk. So that's been a bit of a diffuse rant, and let me try to do something more useful by saying, why do film noir and cyberpunk, I think both are the labels I see people arguing most fiercely about whether or not they are. So why do those labels provoke that particular response?
Well, I think with cyberpunk there's two things. There's a kind of moral aspect to it, which is people say cyberpunk is sort of anti-establishment and it's against big corporations and yada yada. It's pro the little guy, and like everything, it's more complicated than that. It absolutely does have those elements in it, but I wouldn't say it's a fundamentally moral genre. I think it's actually a fundamentally amoral genre that's basically poking fun at the world as they think it might be from the 80s.
Which is funny, because that's noir as well, really, isn't it?
Well, the other thing that makes noir and cyberpunk, I think, a very interesting comparison is the visual aspects. They have such a strong visual identity that you can establish the genre in film with a single shot. It doesn't even need to be motion. If you have a sharp, contrasting shadow on a man's face in a trench coat, everyone immediately goes, this is film noir. And if you have the colour pink on a rainy city and then there's a hot guy with a gun, everyone's like, it's clearly cyberpunk.
Neon, and again, neon features in both, which is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. But I think the problem that these genres have, which maybe lends itself to gatekeeping more than other genres, is because of their incredibly strong visual identity. I think they also have a very strong temporal location. So film noir, as everyone knows, is kind of 1940s, and it's sleek cars and Luger pistols and hats, and cyberpunk is 80s. So it's new synth and neon and big jackets and girls with big hair. And these identities are part and parcel of the genre as it's now packaged up. So you could totally make a film, a noirish game or a cyberpunkish game that didn't have those visuals, but it would be hard to communicate to a player that this game was a cyberpunk game, incorporating all of the traditional elements of cyberpunk, if it didn't look like that, because that's just not what people expect, and that goes back to the whole fundamental point of genre, which is setting expectations in a player. So most people don't do that. Most people keep the whole parcel as it is and say, I'm making a cyberpunk game, it's going to have pink neon, it's going to have rain, it's going to be set in a big city, there's going to be some bad corporations, and you're going to take it down as a sort of slightly amoral little guy, and there's going to be some hacking, and everyone goes, hooray, we love cyberpunk. But I think because it has such a strong identity, and because people feel it is one thing and it so often does conform to that thing, it's harder to branch out, and therefore if you do branch out, like I think Cyberpunk 2077 was doing a lot of interesting things, and it did, I don't know, it still felt like an applicable story to tell in 2021, even though a lot of people said, oh, you know, it hasn't done anything new since the 80s, it's still stuck in the 80s. And even, you know, Blade Runner, which is probably the biggest, the most popular example of cyberpunk in modern conscience. I mean, those films changed a lot of people's lives. Even that still feels like it's doing something more than itself. I know you don't believe it, but I do feel the idea that Cyberpunk 2077 didn't do anything new. I saw narrative effects in there again and again and again that I have never seen in game or film. And I also saw an awful lot of very familiar sort of sub GTA 5 stuff, which is fine, it's a big game. But there's real innovation there. I think you're bang on when you talk about the visual identities of them, because you couldn't make a romantic comedy
and say...
Without
this
Julia
is,
Roberts. It's illegal.
You couldn't make a romantic comedy and say... you couldn't make something you said was a romantic comedy and say this is going to be a sad film about tortoises with no dialogue. I mean, it wouldn't be a romantic comedy.
You're also thinking about Blade Runner, aren't you?
But you could put... I am actually, now you mention it. But yeah, you could put a tortoise in a big hair wig, rain on him or her, and hard to tell with tortoises, and then a spaniel night over it.
And it will be a cyberpunk tortoise.
And to synthwave, and cyberpunk tortoise.
And it will break Reddit.
And then people would say, well, this is outrageous. But and the same thing, if you use cyberpunk iconography to make something that's fundamentally a romantic comedy, a lot of people would be disoriented and possibly cross.
Yeah.
And I think they'd be much more cross if the filmmaker tried to claim it was cyberpunk. But
I think also part of it is the tropes, which I would say is a sort of narrative version of the visual identity.
Yeah.
So, for example, if we go to film noir, we say, well, okay, one of the tropes is that the central character is a hard-boiled detective with a heart of gold, but he's a graphic exterior and he gets beaten up a lot. Right, absolutely fantastic. He's also going to be paired with a femme fatale, who is a sexy lady who almost certainly did the murder, who comes in and makes trouble. And then around that, you can arrange whatever characters you like, but those are two really central tropes of film noir. And I think if you made a film noir game and you really wanted to make it a traditional genre game, you would probably have to have a sexy lady who made trouble. And a lot of people in 2021 would say, well, I'm really bored of women being over-sexualized and portrayed as temptresses, and it's rubbish, and I think you should do better. But of course, maybe that's not the intention of the creator, not to be sexist, but to refer back to an existing trope in a genre which was popularised in the 1930s and 40s, where sexism was a real thing.
And that, again, I think is one of the points. You said they're both very temporally located, and you can't transfer sexual politics from either the 1940s or the 1980s today without causing some reactions. And it's not just the things that people find shocking. There's things that aren't relevant now that are relevant then. Gibson famously held his hand up to having, he's widely considered the godfather of cyberpunk, and he was famous attending surgeon,
for predicting lots and lots of things very accurately,
but not mobile phones.
Infamously not mobile phones. And actually he's a great example, because I read Neuromancer like everybody when I was at university, and it was great in lots of ways, and obviously set cyberpunk off on its particular journey. And I thought recently, with Cyberpunk 2077 coming out, I should read another Gibson, because I haven't read that much, and I enjoyed Neuromancer, so I read his most recent one, which is called Agency. And I turned to you after getting through a couple of chapters, and I said, this feels old. And he's still talking about all the shiny, cool tech that he was talking about in Neuromancer, which is great. As a nerd, I want to hear lots of stories about how cool tech is, disrupting society. And he had updated it, of course, so rather than it being a sort of GPU which hacks into a corporate network off a floppy disk, as it was in Neuromancer, it is now some sort of AI tech that you wear in a pair of glasses, and this is the new thing. So it's not like he's just repeating exactly the same story. He's updating the tech. He's obviously a good writer, and he's interested in the same things, but the way he talked about it felt old. He was talking a lot about Chrome. And I thought, I can't remember, as a millennial, the last time anybody has ever mentioned or used Chrome, ever. And he was talking about kind of like rocker dive bars when it was all a bit scary, but like you could kind of get in if you knew the bouncer. And again, that feels kind of like a kind of 80s trope, that you get the kind of protagonist going down to a scary dive bar in Camden or whatever it was. And sure, they still exist, but it's not really what you hear talked about anymore. So it is a fascinating genre that I think allows for a lot of playfulness, because if you have these existing tropes, you can just do it straight, and you can just have, a nerd hero and a sexy ninja woman and an evil corporate in a suit. Or you can have all those tropes and do something a bit more interesting with it, which I think what CDPR did with Cyberpunk. But it does require people to actually engage with it with an open mind, for them to see what's being done with a lot of the pieces they remember from the 80s, and if we're talking film noir, from the 40s and 30s. And maybe that's partly why there is this sort of clash, because people see tropes and they immediately go, they do not collect money, they pass go, and it means that is a sexist trope, or that is inappropriate for modern age, or that's boring, I've seen that before. And actually, if you play it like you did and spend hours and hours and hours in it, maybe people's minds would change. Maybe it wouldn't. People's opinions are absolutely valid, whatever they are, of course. But I think a lot of people, because it is such a clearly defined genre, took one look at it and thought, isn't it ironic that a game all about destroying the establishment and hating corporates was made by a giant company and made loads of money and was released a bit buggily. And
I think it's worth pointing out that CDPR, although they are obviously wealthy and run by wealthy people, they're the closest thing. No, they are a mega indie. I mean, they've always walked their own path. And if anybody was going to make a game which pushed against established norms, and if you thought
it was
going to
be a bunch of
them, I don't think
Polish
the point of
underdogs
Cyberpunk is to push against established norms. I think an awful lot of Gibson's books, and I like Gibson. I think I've read everything he's written and at least enjoyed it and sometimes loved it. But an awful lot of Gibson books are basically shopping and fucking novels. Where you spend a lot of time enjoying.
It is James Bond for nerds. It really is
exactly that. So you what you often get is either a battle scarred old veteran or a naive or often young heroine, sometimes hero, who's employed by a mysterious evil presence. And I remember Count Zero. I'm not sure. Somebody sort of gets a black credit card and is sent out shopping.
The dream.
To buy stuff in the dream. So you have your cake and eat it, because what you've got is this fundamentally moral person who eventually realises they're working for a wrong and betrays him. Obviously after he's tried to betray them. But in the meantime, they and we can enjoy what it's like to live the luxury lifestyle. And Gibson is obviously fascinated by Russian oligarchs and beautiful tech design and all the rest of it.
That could also be part of why Cyberpunk in particular is such a sort of... people have such strong opinions about it and such conflicting feelings about it, because when I started seeing people say things like, oh, the irony of Cyberpunk 2077 being a cyberpunk game, lol, I went and looked up cyberpunk as a genre, because I knew that it was Neuromancer and Gibson, but I think probably like many people was wrong. It actually started in the 60s and 70s, and it wasn't until Neuromancer in the 80s that it really took off with a particular bent. But if you go back to the originals, if you do a sort of Berlin interpretation on it and you say originally what cyberpunk was, is it isn't defined by the 80s look and the wallet full of, I don't know, plastic banknotes and whatever it is. It's defined by some other stuff. And I'm not a specialist on it, so I think this is where the kind of moral interpretation comes in, the fact that it's meant to be anti-establishment and it's a sort of a dystopia and kind of what the world will be if we continue down this dark path and yada yada yada. But it kind of met this fork in the road when Neuromancer came out, and now there are loads of people who when they think of cyberpunk think entirely of the Gibsonian side of it. And of course there are some traditionalists who have read the Wikipedia page like me, and they know that there are some original changes, but in the common mindset there is only one. It is Neuromancer and everything that looks like Neuromancer,
just as people think that all noir has to start with a dame who's trouble coming to the office,
which to my experience it does, but it's a bit like saying roguelikes are now defined by Cultist Simulator, because in my fantasy land Cultist Simulator was the biggest and most successful game ever made, so the Berlin interpretation doesn't matter anymore. Everyone now knows that in order to be a roguelike you have to be made of cards and have your writing in it and have a spooky soundtrack by a Canadian who lives in the forest, and that's what a roguelike is. And of course there are all these people in the background going, no, this isn't really my roguelike, this is wrong. But if it kind of reaches that water cooler level of everyone now agrees this is the way it is, kind of back to your D&D thing, you can't fight that is what it is. We've done a circle.
We have done a circle. I was going to end.
I hope it was a good circle.
It was ovoid.
An egg. We've done an egg.
Yeah.
Great.
I love eggs. Everyone knows that. I'm going to end on a literary note by talking about Borges talking about Kafka.
Oh my God. Is this because you stumbled earlier on and you feel embarrassed?
Might be. No, well, what Borges said about Kafka is that he started reading Kafka and he thought he was a really unique voice. And he is, but also he kept identifying Kafka-like elements in a bunch of other writers, some of whom lived and died before Kafka, like Robert Browning, I think was one of the people he cited. And he said that Kafka, like all other writers, creates his own precursors, because these qualities, which show up in a bunch of other people, get united in somebody like Kafka.
Right.
And they've been there all along, but you look at them differently once you see one place and they're all united. And I think, Gibson, I said Godfather rather than father because
Because he's a mafia man?
Because I wouldn't want to claim him as the progenitor of Cyberpunk, because, you know, he's the name people go to and he's the most famous. But he brought a bunch of things into relief, and he drew them together.
He captured the imaginations of people.
He did, but he took elements from things like Shockwave Rider and Sheep Look Up and Philip Dick, I guess, is proto-cyberpunk that hadn't been united in the way he united them before, with the sort of dispassionate urban cool that he enjoyed. The Canadians are always cooler than people think. But I'm the last thing I'm going to say is a really nasty quote.
Is this the one that makes you upset?
No, this is a different one.
Okay.
So this is
going to make me upset.
John Bunner's The Sheep Look Up was, I guess, a proto-cyberpunk novel. I think it's one of the things it's normally cited as. And I read it when I was quite young. It depressed the hell out of me. And it's called The Sheep Look Up because it's got an opening quote from Milton's Lycidas.
Right.
Which goes as follows.
Right.
I still remember it. The hungry sheep look up and are not fed, but swollen with wind, and the rank mist they draw, rot inwardly, and foul contagion spread. It's pretty seasonal, given
Milton!
Foul contagion spread.
Well, I thought we were going to end on a lovely note about, you know, how everyone can have their own version of everything and we're all friends, but you've ended it on rotting sheep. After starting it, lest we forget, with fish genitalia.
It's the circle of life, the ellipse of life.
The egg of life.
The egg of life.
Well, that's your lot, people. Let us know what you think. If you have opinions on Cyberpunk, on genre, on roguelikes. I'm really scared that roguelike fans are now going to come and shout at me. Thanks for listening, and have a spooky day.
Have a spooky day.